Okay, we're recording.
Okay, we wanted to talk about Marcel Duchamp, a French artist who began his career really as a cubist. And we're looking at a French artist. We're looking at a really famous painting of his that caused a huge scandal. It's called Nude Descending a Staircase 2. And it dates to 1912, and it was shown, if I remember correctly, in the Armory exhibition in New York, and the press just made wild fun of it.
Was this the first analytic cubist painting they had seen? I mean, Picasso's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon is 1907, so this isn't that long after.
No, and but New York is still a pretty provincial place, and those were outrageous paintings even in Paris.
Yeah, the Armory show really freaked everybody out.
Yeah, so this became really notorious, and of course what we're seeing, this kind of funny cubism that's sort of linked to the way in which the futurists thought of cubism, that is really about the issue of motion itself, movement of the planes of space as a figure is moving down, and it has a wonderful kind of mechanical quality. Some art historians have looked at it and said that this was involved with strobe photography and influenced by some of those sort of those ideas and structures. Nevertheless, it's still a painting. It still
fits within that tradition of painting that really begins in the Renaissance and continues pretty much unabated for 500 years.
Yeah,
this is what art is.
It's
sculpture and architecture and painting.
That's right, and we would call this, avant-garde, but it's still oil paint. It's on canvas. It was made by hand. It's made by the artist. It's rendered, and so you're right. It's still very firmly embedded in this very old tradition.
Easel painting.
Absolutely. So how radical is that? Well, it upset people, but watch what happens 1 year later.
Well, it upset people because it doesn't look real. It's supposed to have an illusion of reality.
It's not a representation of what you see at a specific moment in time.
Right. It's an unfolding of time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And a more analytic and more sort of conceptual.
For some reason, that violated a rule, an important rule. And I think actually sometimes these paintings are still difficult today.
Duchamp, however, did not think that this violated rules enough.
No, he didn't.
And he becomes...
nearly enough.
We would consider him a cubist here, of course, but he'll become one of the main sort of figures in the New York art world that represent Dada.
But if he'd only continued to paint like this, we wouldn't be sitting here and talking about him, quite likely.
That's true.
Or maybe like Picabia or some of the other minor cubists, American cubists.
But Duchamp will go on, because of his sort of theoretical position in relationship to art, to become one of the most important and one of the most influential artists of the 20th century.
Absolutely, and still influential today in the 21st century.
So that's 1912. Let's see what happens just a year later.
Is this a painting?
No, it's two objects made into one. It's an assisted ready-made, as Duchamp will later call them. It's called Bicycle Wheel, and it's a bicycle wheel and headset and fork that's been stuck into a hole that's been drilled into the top of a stool. And Duchamp has taken these two ready-made objects in 1913, stuck them together, and asked us to look at them in a very different way than we would have looked at them before he had done this.
I'm going to say what I think a lot of people feel when they look at this, which is, well, he didn't make it, so how is it art?
He didn't design the wheel.
Right.
It was made in a factory.
He didn't,
how is this art?
Yeah, Michelangelo takes marble and he does something with it. He doesn't just take the marble and say, here's some art with this chisel stuck in it.
I think in a funny way we're going to come back to your question, how is this art? And we're going to find the answer in the very question you're asking. And what I mean to say is Duchamp is asking us to think about how we define what a work of art is. And the very act of questioning becomes a part of the content. But there's more here. One of the things that I think Duchamp wants us to think about is what it is that we want from a work of art.
Why is that an important question for us to ask ourselves?
Well, I think it's a question.
What is art?
I think it's a question that's been asked throughout the avant-garde. Let's go back to Manet for a moment. Manet's rejecting the clarity, the precision academic tradition of the salon, right? And he's forcing us to be aware of the roughness and the physicality of his paint, even as he's rendering something, as opposed to creating something that's more transparent. Yeah, and so even Manet is starting to ask us: is art simply a kind of highly proficient, technically perfect act of rendering? Is it simply skill, or must art also encompass, and of course all great art does, a conceptual element? And what do we actually privilege now in the 20th century, when our culture, and this is I think a really critical point, when our culture is not a culture of the handmade, but our culture is now a culture of the mass-produced. If you think about some of the issues that Braque and Picasso were just at this time raising as well, you have this really important set of distinctions that are being set up. Painting, although is beautiful and remains vital, is in some ways really anachronistic. We live in a society now where everything, virtually everything, is mass-produced.
And things that are unique and hand-produced are very, very rare.
Those are the exceptions, and we privilege them because they are. But
shouldn't art be special like that?
Well, can art be special but speak to our age? Our age of mass production, our age of factory-made objects, our age. Think about the things that we're touching right now.
Maybe art should be the opposite of that.
Well, it can be.
Maybe it should say, well, we still value the things that human beings make.
We do, and we put them in museums very often. But our culture, but here's the way I would ask you to think about it for just a moment. During the 18th century, during the 17th century, making a painting by hand is making a painting the way we made virtually everything else. Garments were made by hand. Furniture was made by hand. Everything was made by hand. We live now in a culture where almost everything is made by some sort of mechanical production. Doesn't art have a responsibility to be, in order to be legitimate, to actually reflect the reality of our moment, even if it means that we're giving up something that we have a kind of nostalgic love for?
Well, that's a good question.
So when Duchamp takes this bicycle wheel, which he didn't make, when he takes this stool that was made in a factory and he puts them together, forcing us through almost a kind of alchemical process, to transform these simple objects that we never really notice into something that is for the contemplative.
So does that mean that one of the definitions of art now is to make us see the world around us anew and afresh? To take a bicycle wheel and look at it in a different way, to take a stool and look at it a different way?
Matisse was once asked, and this is a pretty famous quote, he was once asked, what makes a great artist? And Matisse's answer was, a great artist is someone who allows us to see the world in a way we had never seen it before.
That makes sense to me.
So is art actually then the product of somebody's technical skill? Is it the product of somebody's ability to render? And how legitimate is that now in the age of photography? Or is art really embedded in the conceptual? Has, in a sense, the tide shifted in the 20th century? In the sort of
artistic vision and the artistic idea is what you mean by the conceptual.
That's exactly right. Being able to see the
artist's thought behind the skill.
On the other hand, at the same time, this is absurd, and Duchamp loved that it was absurd. This is Dada. It's a kind of anti-art. It's in some ways a very aggressive stance against art. Let's just go forward for a moment. I want to show you something that's even sort of more pure. This is, I think, fabulous. This is 2 years later. This is 1915. Duchamp has gone into a hardware store, purchased a snow shovel, brought it back to his studio, and decided that he would give it a name, which will conjure up a whole sort of narrative. It's called In Advance of a Broken Arm. And he's taken this ready... as soon
as you said that, I had this vision of someone shoveling snow out on the front stoop of their house, and the heaviness of the snow and the difficulty of that work.
And I continue that narrative. I see that person slipping on the ice and then breaking their arm.
Yep.
And so, but what Duchamp has done is he said, this is not for use. This is now a narrative tool. We're constructing something that is to be thought of and looked at as opposed to used. But it's such an absurd object.
So he's saying that we have some idea in our culture that art is different from things that we use. Art is not utilitarian. And which is an odd thing to say, because to me, if you just go back to medieval art, art is, and even Renaissance, it's always incredibly.
Right.
I mean, it only becomes not utilitarian in the 19th or 18th century.
That's right.
You know, I mean, the Romans thought about it as utilitarian. The Greeks thought about it as, you know, it always served an important
and in a quirky kind
community
of way,
function.
Duchamp, although he's being so radical, is actually adhering to those concerns.
That's right. That art can be more embedded in life.
That's right. He wants to pull it out, even though it is so embedded. And in fact, much of the power of this art is that he is pulling it out, and he is, in a sense, isolating
kind of making us aware of the way that we make something art by taking it out of its ordinary context.
Can we just imagine a scenario where, let's say
we put things in a museum, we put them in a box, we put them against a white wall,
precisely,
and isolate it.
So let's just imagine for a moment this idea where, let's say that this snow shovel, which is very famous, this sculpture in advance of a broken arm.
You can't really call it a sculpture.
Well, a ready-made. Let's say it went up for auction at one of the big auction houses, at Christie's or Sotheby's or something, right? And you know, I'm guessing, but let's say the opening bid is $1.5 million.
Mm-hmm.
And then let's say this is taking place in New York, and you walk out of the showroom while the bidding is starting, and you walk over to Lexington Avenue, and you buy yourself a snow shovel, which is, on the Upper East Side, $40. And somehow you get it past the guards, and you walk back into the showroom, and you've got the very same snow shovel that's being auctioned up for $1.5 million up on the stage.
Yep.
Is there a difference?
I don't know.
You know, it's a really interesting issue, and actually that scenario actually conjures another important issue.
So it reminds us that art is so connected to the artist, himself or herself, that the art becomes valuable because of the art. Because of the artist and not because of the material that the object is made from.
In a sense, the scenario that I just offered suggests that Duchamp failed. And let me explain. Dada itself, and this is kind of a New York variant now, but Dada itself is embedded in the artist's reactions against the violence of the First World War to some extent.
And against sort of bourgeois culture.
Well, one of the indictments that the artist made was that art had been one of the props by which bourgeois culture had maintained itself. That is, people
separated itself out from working class culture.
Exactly.
We
buy art,
right.
We buy
we
art,
can
and we're important
art.
as a result.
Right.
That's right. And maintains itself.
And we have a kind of sensibility that appreciates art.
Now remember, the First World War is not fought for ideological reasons. It's really fought largely for greed, national greed, personal greed, etc. There are a lot of issues in the First World War that were really about a kind of corruption and a kind of disregard for ordinary people, absolutely, and
who were sent out to the trenches to die by the millions.
And it was unprecedented, the violence of the First World War. So we have the Dada artists thinking about how they can create an art that completely undermines that notion of art as being helping to establish hierarchical status.
But then it's being sold at Christie's or something.
Well, that's why I said, in a sense, that would suggest that Duchamp failed. Because, I mean, I think that there's something...
It just got reincorporated back into the old system. That old system must be
very
damn powerful.
Capitalism is incredibly powerful.
Yes.
But what Duchamp is trying to do is subvert capitalism to some extent as it relates to art here. That is to say, Duchamp is saying, I'm going to make art out of something that is absolutely ordinary. Can that be done? Must art be singular and precious? You know, you walk into somebody's house, and if they have an original painting by Picasso hanging on the wall, that says a lot about their status in our society.
Right.
But if somebody has a snow shovel, maybe not.
Right.
Although he's so entered the canon of art history now that, as you said, he's been himself swallowed.
Yes, but you still have to have a little label next to it. You know, if you walked into someone's house on Park Avenue, and you know, it'd still have to have a little label, so you didn't just think they had gotten done shoveling and leaned
Maybe
in
Duchamp
against
realized
the wall.
He needed to be even more outrageous.
Maybe.
And
so that was 1915.
Right.
And this is
2 years later again. This is 1917.
Another ready-made?
Another ready-made, and of course it's a urinal.
An upside-down urinal.
Well, he takes it, he shifts it 90 degrees, exactly. And Duchamp actually submits it to an exhibition that was an unjuried show. And you have to remember that in the and early 20th centuries, many art exhibitions were juried and were relatively conservative. Well, here was what was supposed to be a radical organization that was going to show anything and not have a juried exhibition. Duchamp submits this, and it's rejected. Of course, because it's not art.
He crossed the line even of the avant-garde.
That's exactly right.
But it looks like there's a signature on it.
Well, he signed it R. Mutt, and there are some theories about why he signed it R. Mutt.
He seems like a very silly man.
I think that there was a kind of ludicrousness to it, and I think he took a certain joy in the absurd. There's no question. And I think that that's pretty clear in the way that he would present himself to the public, often in drag, representing his alter ego, Rose Celevet.
So this is Duchamp himself.
This is the artist himself.
So he's really just interested in play.
He's interested
in taking categories
and
subverting categories.
All kinds of play, visual play and also word play, which is embedded in a lot of his work, and a more literal kind of play. Later in his life, he would reject art, in fact, as an occupation, and say that he wanted to spend the rest of his life simply playing chess. This is an exhibition of his out in California.
She's naked.
Yeah, she is. Well, he's trying to keep up appearances.
Poking fun, perhaps, at the idea of the nude?
I think so. He would be lying, though, when he said he wouldn't make art any longer. He made art, actually, to the end of his life in secret.
When you say making art, you don't actually mean making art.
Well, not painting. That's true.